Let me now give the floor to Greg Aftandilian, Armenia in US foreign policy.
Thank you very much. I want to thank first the conference organizers for having invited me to this conference. I realize my topic is somewhat controversial because I talk about the diminishing importance of Armenian and US foreign policy. But I aim to present what I see as how Armenia has been perceived by US foreign policymakers since the early 1990s. And I argue that it has declined as a country of importance for the United States since that time. Foreign policy, including US foreign policy, is determined by ideas and interests. While sometimes the former comes to the forefront, the latter usually prevails, and this is part of my argument in my paper. The other argument in my paper is that there are some similarities if you look at the period of the genocide and through the late 1920s in terms of US foreign policy towards Armenia, and I'll allude to that in the talk. My article is based on some scholarly works, White House documents that have been in the public domain, interviews with both Armenian and American diplomats and Armenian-American lobbyists. I also reflect on my own personal experiences having worked in the US government during much of this period, particularly in the US Senate. I worked for several pro-Armenian US senators, and I was kind of what they call in the trenches on many political battles during this period, so I'm speaking oftentimes firsthand from my own experiences. I'd like to start really with the late 1980s because in 1988 two major events occurred, as many of you know. First was the Karabakh movement that's been talked about. That really began in the early part of 1988, and then towards the end of 88 we have the Armenian earthquake. Both of those issues really put Armenia in the forefront in terms of news that American policymakers were getting about Armenia. And it's interesting that for those of you old enough to remember the earthquake period, it was almost all of a sudden the United States and the American people are rediscovering Armenia once again. There was almost a replication of the assistance that was given to Armenia during the time of the Near East relief and from the late period of World War I to 1930, because the American people were very, very generous in their support for the victims of the earthquake. But also the Karabakh movement itself was quite interesting. If you look at kind of the press coverage of that period in the United States, there was a lot of sympathetic press coverage in the United States to the Karabakh nationalist movement, and the Armenians were seen as kind of heroic fighters fighting for national self-determination. And as we all know, that kind of snowballed into other peoples of the former Soviet Union challenging Soviet authority and eventually leading to the breakup of the Soviet Union. Of course, the breakup of the Soviet Union is the result of many factors, but certainly the national factor was a big one. There was much support from Congress, especially, and from the administration. President George H.W. Bush even sent his son Jeb and his grandson to the earthquake zone shortly after the earthquake. Many members of the U.S. Senate, helped facilitate things like airlifts of supplies. So Armenia is really coming up there in terms of the news in the late 1980s. As many of you know in the audience, the Karabakh Committee that was formed in Yerevan soon morphed into the Armenian National Movement. And then through a series of events, they proceeded to basically break Armenia away from the Soviet Union, but they did so in a very legalistic and nonviolent way within the Armenian Republic. They actually followed Soviet laws in this process of elections. And basically by 1990, you had a situation where there's now a non-communist government in Armenia, and they're actually implementing reforms like free market reforms, giving peasants their own land, instituting multi-candidate elections, things like that. So all of these reforms and the way the Armenians conducted themselves during this period of, say, 89 to 91 was very well perceived in the United States. So Levon Ter-Petrosyan comes to the United States in 1990, also in 1991, and he was very well received by American officials. The first visit by Ter-Petrosyan to America, he didn't meet with President Bush, but he did meet with his national security advisor, Brent Scowcroft, and he did meet with members of Congress. But the second meeting, and this is right after Armenia, or soon after Armenia became independent, Bush did meet him in the White House. They had a 45-minute meeting. But it was also interesting, too, if you look at this situation, the Armenian American community, which we all know has been very divided over many issues over many decades, they kind of came together during this period because, one, there was a great sense that Armenia is now in a position of being rebirthed, if you will, and has now become part of the new nations of the democratic order. And in fact, Levon Ter-Petrosyan actually used Armenian American interpreters for his meetings with President Bush and other high-ranking officials. He could have used people from Yerevan who knew English well, but symbolically, I think that was also important because it showed how the Armenian American community was very much in sync with what was going on in Armenia. The old political parties, that's another story because they kind of dragged their feet in terms of recognizing that this is a truly an independent movement that the people wanted, but that's another story altogether. The U.S. airlifted many supplies to Armenia, and let me just read you a couple of White House documents from this period. This is right after the meeting between President George H.W. Bush and Levon Ter-Petrosyan. The president, in other words, President Bush, said that the U.S. intended to build a strong relationship with Armenia. And then in 1992, as a result of the shortages in Armenia, both for fuel and also for food, the U.S. Started to airlift massive supplies of food to Armenia. And the White House statement said, quote, "Today's action by the president demonstrates a new U.S. commitment to the welfare of the Armenian people and to the independence of Armenia. It is another example of the close bilateral relationship between the United States and the government of Armenian President Levon Ter-Petrosyan." So that was George H.W. Bush. Of course, you know, he's a politician, and of course an election was coming up soon, so you can't discount the fact that, you know, he's trying to drum up support politically in the United States, but many people have said, and I agree with this, is that George H.W. Bush was really the foreign policy president. In fact, probably one of the reasons why he lost to Bill Clinton in '92 was he probably spent too much time on foreign policy and not enough time on domestic policy. So I think this was kind of a genuine sentiment of the Bush administration initially. Things started to change, though, by the mid-1990s. And there were several reasons for this change in terms of U.S. attitude. First was that within Armenia itself, the government of Levon Ter-Petrosyan started to implement authoritarian practices. This included his crackdown on the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, the ARF, but also a couple of elections of 1994, 1995 were considered tainted, and there was opposition activity against the outcomes of these elections. Two, and this is a very important one, maybe the most important one, is the development of the oil resources in next door in Azerbaijan and the U.S. emphasis on east-west pipelines. This is very important because the U.S. Was trying to get not just oil flowing from east to west, from Azerbaijan up through Georgia, down through Turkey into the Mediterranean, but it also saw Baku as a kind of a way station for oil from the Central Asian republics. And the idea was that, as one U.S. diplomat told me, to actually have some of these Central Asian republics or the republics around the Caspian Basin be less dependent on Russia. And if more oil is flowing to the Mediterranean, this would also make perhaps Western Europe, or now even Eastern Europe, less dependent on Russian gas. So that was a big development in U.S. foreign policy. And I studied history in college, and I always like to bring up historical examples, but after the United States kind of turned its back on Armenia in 1920, there was an emphasis placed on reestablishing ties with Kemal Ataturk's regime. And one Democratic U.S. senator stated, show this administration an oil well, and it will show you a foreign policy. And he was referring to the Coolidge administration, and perhaps one can say this was the attitude of the Clinton administration from the mid-90s. This is also a time, too, that the Armenians are getting closer to Russia strategically. Military bases are, of course, established. There's a friendship treaty in 1997. Congress is still supportive of Armenia. In fact, the Armenian-American lobbying organizations are very active during this period, but there's certainly a tilt now by the Clinton administration towards Azerbaijan because of the oil. And the Clinton administration starts to use the term territorial integrity to deal with the Nagorno-Karabakh issue. In other words, self-determination is now kind of in the back burner. Territorial integrity now comes to the forefront in terms of U.S. language. Deputy Secretary of State Strobe Talbot, he's a Russian expert by training. He's basically the guy in charge of U.S. foreign policy towards the states of the former Soviet Union. He believed he had a deal with Levon-Petrosyan on the Nagorno-Karabakh issue, but then in early '98, the proposal that was going to be accepted caused kind of a revolt within the Armenian hierarchy, the government hierarchy, and Levon-Petrosyan was compelled to resign. This led then that proposal to be put on ice for a while. And this led to a very negative perception by Strobe Talbot and other high-ranking U.S. officials towards Armenia by the late 1990s. And in fact, one U.S. diplomat told me in candor that Armenia was viewed as more trouble than their Armenians as a collective were seen as more trouble than they're worth. Armenia did try, though, to make some amends with the United States. I guess under our guest here today, Vartan Oskanyan, this idea of complementarity was pursued. That means that you're pursuing a foreign policy that's not a zero-sum game. You can still have good relations with the United States despite the fact you have good relations with Russia. And Armenia did join, NATO's Partnership for Peace program. Later on, they sent peacekeeping troops to Kosovo. They sent non-combatant troops to Iraq and, military trainers to Afghanistan. And actually, in the spring of 2001, there was new talks on Nagorno-Karabakh in the Key West city of Florida. Both President Kochari and President Aliyev from Azerbaijan came to Key West, and they actually came quite close to a deal. But when I think Aliyev went back to Baku, he had second thoughts about it, and the deal never went through. For a short period then, U.S. foreign policymakers started to see Armenia as kind of a reasonable party, so it wasn't just a one-sided thing. But then 9/11 happened just a few months later, and 9/11 had this great shock to the American psyche. And what happened here is that the perception in the U.S. Congress and within the U.S. administration was that Azerbaijan was much more forthcoming to the United States than Armenia, because the perception was Armenia always had to check its back with Russia, whereas Azerbaijan was very willing to open up its air bases and do X, Y, and Z to help the United States in its time of need. Now, of course, Armenian diplomats have since criticized that perception And there's probably valid reasons to criticize that perception. But nonetheless, that perception was there on Capitol Hill, and I was there at the time. And this then led to Section 907 that had restricted U.S. assistance to Azerbaijan being waived by the U.S. Congress. And I was intimately involved in trying to not have that waiver take place, but we made sure, working with very pro-Armenian members of the Senate, to say that whatever military assistance would be given to Azerbaijan would not be used for offensive action against Armenia, and also whatever military assistance would be given to Azerbaijan, the same level would be given to Armenia, so there would be military parity. And that was a way to kind of mitigate that waiver of Section 907. A few other issues then come to the fore through the 2000s, and that of course, is the issue of corruption, the lack of good governance, as an issue affecting U.S. Attitudes towards Armenia. There were problematic elections as well. One example was of the perception of poor governance was the MCC, that's the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which was set up by the U.S. government to give aid to certain countries that are developing, but in return for that aid, they had to show progress on democracy and good governance. And some of this money was put to good use. Initially, it was for rural infrastructure projects that Armenia keenly needs. But the United States put Armenia on notice in late 2008 that MCC funding could stop. And in fact, in 2009, that funding did in fact stop because of this issue of lack of good governance. Many of you know the NGO Freedom House, and I just sort of want to bring us up to date a little bit, but the Freedom House issued a report, it's on the web, in 2017. They classify Armenia as a semi-consolidated authoritarian state. Azerbaijan is a consolidated authoritarian state, whereas Georgia is what they call a hybrid state. So Armenia is nudged between Azerbaijan and Georgia in terms of the Freedom House's characterization, but to be called a semi-consolidated authoritarian state is not a very good characterization. And the State Department, with its annual human rights reports in particular, have noted in its most recent report problems with law enforcement, ruling party dominance of the state apparatus. So this perception of Armenia as a country that lacks good governance is really in contrast to the period of the early 1990s, when it seemed that Armenia was doing all the right things democratically and moving in a very positive direction. So that certainly has hurt the image of Armenia in the United States. Now, what about this issue of Armenia's relations with Russia? On the one hand, some U.S. diplomats who were stationed in Armenia, they kind of understood that because Armenia is in a tough neighborhood, as has been discussed many times here in this conference, they're going to have a relationship with Russia. The question is, to what extent is that relationship? It seems that over the last several years, the relationship has deepened to the point where many U.S. officials have privately labeled Armenia as kind of a vassal state of Russia. Now, to be fair to the Armenian government, when you look at what happened in Georgia in 2008, when there was this mini war between the United States and Georgia had recently said that they wanted to join NATO, and many Georgians felt that the U.S. were going to come to their aid. In the end, the United States, except for rhetorical support, really didn't do much for Georgia in face of Russian attacks on Georgia. So in that respect, one could be sympathetic towards the Armenian government, saying that, well, we can't throw all of our eggs in the U.S. basket, but because at the end of the day, we have this example of what happened in 2008 vis-a-vis Georgia. But on the other hand, the extent of the Russian dominance in Armenia has certainly grown over the past decade. And we heard yesterday about the whole customs union and all that. And in many respects, I agree with the statement that Armenia may have been better off not joining either union, the European Union or the Eurasia Union, because now they're tied to this Russian customs union. Finally, let me just say a few words about the Armenian-American lobby and how that fits into this relationship between Armenia and the United States. I think, as I said before, in the early years, there was a great amount of support once it appeared that Armenia was really headed towards independence, particularly by 1991, from the entire Armenian-American community towards the new Armenia. This changed a bit when Levon Ter-Petrosyan started to crack down on the ARF, or Armenian Revolutionary Federation. But the lobby has been, once Ter-Petrosyan resigned, that unity of purpose to get assistance for Armenia resurfaced. But the lobby has been instrumental in getting assistance to Armenia. The figure is, since the early 90s, the US government has given Armenia something like $2 billion overall. Now, this has been on a downward slope over the past several years, and today the assistance level is something around 11 or 12 million. It at one point was about $102 million. And for many years, Armenia per capita was the second largest recipient of foreign aid outside of US support for Israel. And the joke in Congress when I was there was that the administration would always lowball the figure for US assistance to Armenia, knowing that the Armenian-American lobbying groups and pro-Armenian members of Congress would always boost it up. And for a figure like in 2006, the Bush administration said Armenia should get 55 million. Congress then appropriated 75 million. So the lobby has been very instrumental, at least keeping this assistance up, and also being a balancer to other lobbies, like the oil lobby was very powerful, in support of Azerbaijan. And the oil lobby gives a lot of money to members of Congress, and the Armenian-American groups were kind of a balancer to that system. But the lobby is not all powerful. They haven't, say, even in this recent incident of April of 2016 that Emil just spoke about, they haven't been able to get the U.S. government to condemn Azerbaijani aggression against the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh and against Azerbaijani atrocities against some Armenians in the northern part of Karabakh. There was mutilations of Armenian bodies, and the U.S. didn't, condemn that. So sometimes the lobby can be very effective, and other times it has its limitations as well. So finally, let's return to the original premise. As I said, foreign policy is based on ideas and interests. Today, the United States does not see Armenia as a promising democracy, and it's oftentimes lumped together with other post-Soviet states that have similar problems in governance. So what is the U.S. interest right now? I would argue it's basically to manage the Nagorno-Karabakh problem, to prevent basically a full-scale war, but that's not a ringing endorsement of Armenia. It's just that it's a policy to prevent something. And so the fundamentals of the idea issue as that component of U.S. foreign policy to support a democratic aspiring state has really kind of diminished. And that's the reason why I chose that title for my paper. So what is really to be done now, as Lenin once said, what is to be done? I think there's no way that, that Armenia is going to break relations with Russia, and we don't know the Trump administration's policy towards Russia because one day he says one thing, one day he says another. We know from this whole Syria thing, who knows what's going to happen vis-a-vis Russia. But there are a couple of things could happen. If Armenia becomes less corrupt, more democratic, that would certainly, I think, help Armenia's image in Washington, and two, if it becomes perhaps less dependent on Russia and have a more even-handed policy, that would also help Armenia's image in Washington. So those are the two things that I would see that's probably at least somewhat doable in the near future if Armenia has the political will to do that. So with that, I'll end my talk, and I'll be happy to answer questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Gregory.